Welcome to Health Empowered, the podcast where I dive into all things health, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. I'm Adriana, a trauma-informed physiotherapist and yoga teacher. On this podcast, I'll be interviewing experts in their health fields and humans living through healthcare experiences to provide you, the listener, with education and heartfelt stories. Let's learn together. Today on the podcast, I welcome Emma Donald. Emma is a registered clinical counselor and runs a private practice in Victoria, BC, where she sees individuals and couples. She works with a variety of presenting issues, including relationship challenges, body image issues, life transitions, depression, anxiety, grief, and trauma. She views each client she works with as unique and draws from a variety of modalities to tailor treatment. These modalities include dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, parts work, inner child work, the Gottman Method, and acceptance and commitment therapy. Emma is currently taking on new clients, and you can look at the show notes for ways to connect with her. Today on the podcast, we dive deep into relationships. I am so excited for you to learn from her. Let's get to the episode. Hi, Emma. Welcome to the Health Empowered podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am so excited to have you. You are the first mental health care practitioner that I'm having on the platform, so I'm really excited to dive into some different topics with you.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, I am. I'm so excited to get started. So you are a clinical counselor. And so I was hoping to start, you could just share what brought you to becoming a counselor, the journey of that, and why you decided to do that.
For sure. So I think a bunch of things brought me to it, probably like most people with career choices. I've always been drawn to different helping roles. So kind of in my past career life, I did childcare in a number of different ways. I was a house parent at one of the boarding schools here in Victoria, and then also worked at a spinal rec center for years and years, doing summer camps and birthday parties and preschool and that sort of thing. And then when I finished my undergrad, I was a support worker with vulnerable adults here in town. So sort of a bunch of different kind of mental health roles, supporting roles, and then going into counseling felt like kind of a natural next step from there. When I was like 10 or 11 and I found out what a therapist was, I wanted to become a therapist for whatever reason. So I feel like it's something I've been really drawn to. And then kind of through different life experiences, volunteer and work experiences, it felt like a natural step for me. So, yeah.
Sounds like you've done quite a few different things in your life.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I started working when I was 11 or 12, like just babysitting and that kind of thing. And then, started at the rec center when I was probably 13 or 14. So I feel like along the way, I kind of have done a number of different iterations of things.
Yeah, definitely. Since you're here today, I wanted to dive a lot into relationships and how relationships in general impact our health and a variety of things that we can kind of dive into about relationships. So perhaps you could start by just sharing, how relationships impact our health in general, and not just romantic relationships, but the relationships that we have with our friends, parents, coworkers, everyone, essentially.
For sure. Yeah. So I think relationships have a gigantic impact on your mental and physical health. There's research to support that. And then also just anecdotally, I think most of us can relate to that. When you have, a relationship that's going really well in your life, everything can feel easier, and vice versa. When life is stressful, it can be the easiest to take that out on the people closest to you. And like you said, that can be in your friendships, that can be in your romantic relationships, that could be with your colleagues, all sorts of relationships, family, of course. So I think one of the common misconceptions, though, is people feel like any relationships are better than none, which is true. Social isolation is terrible for us. However, staying in a very, very unhappy relationship is actually worse for your health than being single or not having that relationship in your life. So that is something to note too. You want to have relationships, but they also need to be healthy, productive, uplifting relationships.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You saying that, I'm like, that makes complete sense. It would be really awful to be in a relationship where you don't feel like you can be yourself, or you're being abused in some way, right? There's a lot of different ways that relationships can be awful. And of course, it makes sense that it would be healthier to be single or to be alone. But I think that you're right in the sense that it's ingrained in us, I believe, evolutionarily, that we need connection. And so I think it can be really hard for people to feel happier potentially or healthier being alone. Do you see that that's the case at times?
Definitely. And I was just to do my homework a little bit before we came to record, I was just looking at some of the research because, of course, I see people in my work every day, but I don't know kind of the broader research and what it's showing. And I was just looking at this study that looked at couples during the pandemic and then singles during the pandemic. So it came out late 2020, and they found that people in healthier relationships were better off, but that singles were better off than people in unhealthy relationships too. And so they were looking at depression, stress markers, and then also physical health markers. So things like incidences of illness, like contracting COVID, but then also, as I'm sure you see, like headaches, chronic pain, that sort of thing. So that was pretty fascinating to see, and so recent too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That is fascinating. I love research on this kind of stuff. We're talking about healthy relationships. What would you say defines a healthy relationship, or is there a specific definition that defines a healthy relationship?
Yeah, great question. So it's complicated, right? And it can look different for different people. Like we all have different expectations, different boundaries, different amounts of bandwidth that we have for different relationships. So I would say it can take many different forms. How you interact with your fiance is going to look different than how you and I interact and what we expect, or what you expect of a client or patient versus your closest family member or your closest friends. But I would say certainly, as you mentioned, like the absence of abuse, the absence of put downs, unhealthy power dynamics, those kinds of things would be definitely no-goes. And then I would say, sort of basic things like respect, open communication, having some boundaries in place, that kind of thing. So it's not bad to have expectations of other people. In fact, we should, but evaluating what are those expectations and how are they serving both of us. I think, too, another kind of misconception about healthy relationships is that there's an absence of conflict, where, I see couples that come into my practice who they say we don't fight, and there's just been this silence between us for months or potentially years or decades. That's not necessarily the sign of a healthy relationship. So how are you navigating your conflict? Do you have the skills to overcome that and be honest and support one another through that? Or is it huge blowout fights, or just a complete absence of talking about things and sweeping everything under the rug?
Yeah, I think being able to navigate conflict and have healthy conflict could probably be a whole podcast episode because it's something that's obviously unavoidable, whether it's a romantic relationship or a work relationship or friends. There's always going to be some sort of conflict, right? Not everyone's going to get along at all times or have the same beliefs or values. So yeah, I bet that's extremely important in healthy relationships, being able to navigate that.
Definitely. And I think people are often so fearful of sharing any expectation or any boundary because they feel like that implies unhealthy conflict. But saying, I need to leave at 5 p.m. tonight because I have an event to get to, that's not fighting with your boss. That's just clearly communicating your expectations. Or likewise with a friend saying, hey, I can't text you back during my work day. That's not necessarily going to create an argument or a fight. Actually being proactive and communicating about things and stating your expectations clearly can avoid future conflict down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, or maybe you've seen this in your practice, makes it hard for people to set these expectations or to set these boundaries in the first place?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a big question. I feel like we could talk about that for hours. And I think there's such a mix of how you were raised. So what was modeled to you, perhaps attachment style and your comfortability with coming out and saying what you need to say. And then, like I mentioned, how you were raised, how was conflict handled in your home, those sorts of things. And then I think too about how we're socialized. So different cultures have different expectations around how you can clearly communicate or not. And then I think there's sometimes, a gender piece, a race piece, ethnicity, all of these things can come into the conversation. So if there's that power differential because of your race or your ability or your sexuality or, something like that, then that can impact your ability to be able to communicate clearly.
Yeah, completely. I'm just sitting here thinking of how hard relationships are.
Oh my God. Yes. Yeah, they are.
Yeah, there's just like so many different things that can impact the way you communicate, the way you think relationships should be. Yeah, the things that you were exposed to growing up and the relationships that you were around growing up are going to impact the way you are now. So it's just wild, the amount of things that can impact it.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I think too about, not only what was modeled to us in our family of origin, but also what's modeled to us in the media. So what are the representations of relationship? So much media, I think, shows us you meet somebody and you fall in love and then the credits roll and maybe your friendships are sort of like a side story in that movie or TV show that you're watching. But that's not the reality for so many people. So, for some people, friendship and their chosen family is sort of the center of their world, and maybe their romantic relationship is off to the side, or they're taking a break from dating or that kind of thing. Or likewise, maybe you don't have sort of the picture perfect family relationships, but you've chosen people to take that place of family in your life. So I think sort of evaluating what stories have I taken in and what do I believe that I, quote, should do versus what is actually right for me is important. Mm-hmm. How do I want to be in relationship? What nourishes me? What kind of people do I want to surround myself? That kind of thing, as opposed to what you have to be doing or should be doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, but just based on what you just said, I feel like I already know the answer. But I was going to ask, is there actually a right way to have a relationship?
Right. I mean, yeah, I think sort of with the absence of abuse or neglect or those types of things, mm-hmm. I think if that's not coming into the equation, then I think there are so many ways to have a healthy relationship.
Yeah, there's not like one specific cookie cutter way to be in a relationship or have relationships with friends or.
Right. And in fact, I don't think you should. Sort of back to what I was saying before, like the expectations you would have of a romantic partner would be different from a colleague and those kinds of things. So not to say you should shapeshift and be a different person, but just that the way that you're going to show up to those relationships, the unwritten and written rules of engagement in those relationships are going to look different, and they should.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Exactly. I'm sure that the way that I speak to my boss would be very different than the way I speak to my fiance.
Definitely. Yeah.
You have mentioned a few misconceptions mm-hmm. about relationships. Are there any others that come to mind?
Yeah, I think there's so many. When I think about long-term romantic relationships, sort of the expectations that we put on our partners, I think you and I have talked about this off the air previously about we now have this idea of, I'm going to have my soulmate, I'm going to have my best friend, I'm going to have my travel buddy, my business partner, all of these things that you put onto one person, and it's just often too much for one person to handle. And so I think looking at your needs and then diversifying that, if you will. So, maybe you have a really nourishing conversation about mental health with a close friend. Maybe you talk about your career stuff that you're passionate with a colleague or with your boss. Maybe you rely on your romantic partner for those romantic, intimate pieces of yourself. And maybe there's parts of running a household together that are great for you. So looking at how can I get my needs met from a wide array of people. So I think that's a big misconception, that your one partner needs to be everything at all times for you. Another thing that comes to mind is boundaries. So this is such a buzzy thing on social media right now, boundaries. I think there's a misconception that boundaries means I'm going to control how you behave. And it's actually more about what you are willing and unwilling to accept. So if you start drinking, I will leave. I cannot answer my text messages between the hours of 8 and 5. So it's not saying, hey, don't text me throughout the day. It's saying, this is what I can and cannot do, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I really like that reframe. That's a great way of looking at boundaries, because I think that people can potentially use boundaries as a way of not even necessarily on purpose, but maybe subconsciously to control other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's kind of that misconception of this is how I'm going to dictate what you're going to do, as opposed to looking at your own side of the street and determining, what you can and cannot accept.
Yeah. Amazing. You've mentioned obviously how relationships can impact mental health. We've talked about that. Do you know of any studies, or have you seen the way that relationships impact your physical health?
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of research to support that. So that COVID study that I mentioned before, they found that people, in unhappy relationships were more likely to contract COVID and more likely to have those physical symptoms. I don't know the specific study, but I've read that being completely socially isolated is actually worse for your health than being a lifelong smoker. People in happy relationships, happy long-term committed relationships, outlive those in unhappy relationships. And then, I think the manifestation of physical pain, of mental pain as physical pain, there's lots and lots of research and more research as time goes on to support that. So things like fibromyalgia, chronic physical pain, headaches, skin disorders like eczema, those kinds of things. They're finding more and more links to adverse childhood experiences, single incident traumatic events, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's wild how much the brain and the body are connected.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely something I see a lot in my practice as well, working with chronic pain.
Yes, and it's nice that there's more and more research to support that, because I think you and I both see that anecdotally in the clinical setting, but to feel like, okay, there's actually some research to support this, hopefully will help to figure out more ways sort of on the global scale or on the larger scale to then support folks to not get to that end point of living with chronic pain.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious if you could share some tips for people, for the listeners, on ways that they can communicate in relationships that will be healthier ways to communicate, better ways. Not sure what other words we can use, but just a different way, or perhaps a better way of communicating in any of their relationships.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that there's lots of things that you can do. I think being honest with yourself as a starting point about where you're strong at communicating and where you could use improvement is a good place. So sort of looking at your side of the street. I think I've said that already during our recording. I say that all the time to people. It would be great if you could dictate how other people move through the world and sort of fix everybody so that you wouldn't have problems, but ultimately you have to change what you're doing. So looking at that, maybe you're really effective at communicating your needs and boundaries at work, but maybe in close friendships or in romantic relationships you struggle, or maybe you're great with your romantic partner, but for whatever reason, because of your family history, you struggle to do that with your parents. So I think being honest about your own strengths and weaknesses is a good place to start. Figure out what you're working with, and then begin to set some goals of how you could improve. I think the idea of being kind but firm is also good. So how can you be honest about what you're experiencing, what you'd like to change, but also be assertive at the same time? So that's a good way to start too. And then I think there's such an avoidance of conflict, like we were talking about earlier in our conversation. So sort of any boundary setting being seen as conflict. But in my experience, both personally and professionally, if you keep avoiding having that hard conversation, then it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing. And then it can lead to this sort of unmanageable level of frustration or resentment or sadness or whatever it is. So being proactive, having conversations sort of as things come up can help you to avoid to get into a place where maybe the relationship can't continue anymore, or the dynamic is so set in stone that it's very difficult to change.
Those sound like excellent tips. I can see that there will probably be people who are listening and they're like, oh gosh, like I have to be assertive or I have to set a boundary. Like this is terrifying. What would you say to those people who are listening to that and they're instantly just like, oh gosh, this seems too hard?
Yeah, well, I'm going to pull from one of my personal heroes. Her name is Nedra Tawwab. She's quite a famous therapist. She's got a big following on Instagram. So if people are looking for a place to start, I would recommend following her and reading her books and so on. But she talks a lot about this is going to feel uncomfortable at first. You're going to feel guilty. It's going to feel out of your comfort zone. Feel those things and set the boundary at the same time too. So if you're waiting for the absence of fear or absence of discomfort to set the boundary, you might be waiting until you leave this planet. And so recognizing this is sort of part of the process, like learning any new skill, it's going to be hard at first. Feel the discomfort and set the boundary. It's probably going to lead to a healthier relationship, or minimally for you to feel better about the boundaries that you've set for yourself and feeling like you're living a more authentic life.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice, because you're right. There's so many things in life that are super uncomfortable, and then we do them and we realize, okay, I survived that. Like, it was uncomfortable. It might not have been my favorite thing, but I'm okay.
Yeah, and there's this, it's sort of cheesy and overused, but this idea of the relationship that you want is on the other side of the hard conversation you're scared to have. I think there's so much wisdom in that. 9 times out of 10, when you just bring it out into the open and say how you feel, as long as you're doing it in a kind, authentic way, usually people are receptive to that and want to hear where you're coming from. So that can lead to, a healthier, more productive relationship going forward.
Yeah, what would you say, because you said usually people are receptive, like for the odd time that, I'm just trying to think of an example here where maybe you're having a conflict with a friend and you decide, okay, I'm finally going to set this boundary. It's going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to do it anyway. And you set the boundary and the person's response is just not what you were expecting, whether or not their response was, they start yelling at you, or they just start saying really mean things to you, or they just completely ignore you. What would you tell someone in that situation?
Yeah, good question, because I think you're right. People aren't always going to be completely receptive, completely calm, smack themselves upside the head and say, thank you for bringing this to my attention. I would say it's so situation specific. So, if you're really struggling with a conflict like this or a one-sided relationship in your life, I would say that might be the time to reach out to talk to a mental health professional. It's hard for me to say sort of a blanket statement when I don't know people's individual situations. What I would say, though, is sometimes people need time. So, I'm certainly guilty of this sometimes too, where I'll hear feedback, I'll feel initially defensive or initially sad or upset. And then given a bit of time, then I can see the person's perspective. So I would say just because somebody doesn't sort of instantly embrace exactly what you're saying doesn't mean that they will never come around to it. Sometimes we need a couple of opportunities to course correct. And I think particularly that's the case in things like family relationships, romantic relationships, close friendships. If you're seeing that sort of repeated pattern of behavior where there's huge emotional outbursts or people are stonewalling or pushing you away, then I think it could be time to reevaluate that relationship. So is that relationship still serving you? If that person is unwilling to change, then can you continue to exist in that relationship and not feel like you're sacrificing yourself? I don't know if you've heard the Prentice Hemphill quote, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously.
Oh, I haven't. I like that though.
Yeah, so I think about that a lot. How much of yourself are you sacrificing in order to make that other person comfortable or avoid the conflict? Can you live with that level? Or does there perhaps need to be a boundary set so that loving them and loving you can coexist?
Yeah, I feel like there's so many things that we can just dive deep onto, which we don't have time for, but I'm just like sitting here listening and I'm like, oh gosh, yeah, I'm thinking about even myself, like before I went to therapy and the way of communicating that I've obviously learned through years and years of just being a physiotherapist and going to therapy and reading books and listening to podcasts and all those kinds of things. Like someone who is, let's say, at the very start of their mental health journey, like this is maybe their first podcast that they've listened to on relationships and communication. What is one tiny piece of advice that you would give to that person who's just starting their journey?
Wow. Okay. Good question. I would say welcome. This is a good place to be. There's so much for you to learn. And I would say be compassionate to yourself. That would be my one piece of advice. So we all get handed down ways of interacting, ways of being, and, as we talked about previously in our conversation, what we've absorbed from the media, from our peers, and so on. So if you're doing this imperfectly, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means you're a human being. So go easy on yourself, take your time. There's going to be some trial and error. You're going to mess up, and just sort of embrace that as part of the process and take note of the ways in which you are succeeding or you are growing.
I love that. That's such beautiful advice for someone. Just, having that self-compassion for yourself, because it is a journey.
Mm-hmm.
We're human beings and we're just trying our best, right? So
yeah,
such good advice. I have one more question I wanted to dive into before I ask the 2 questions that I typically ask to everyone.
Okay.
Hopefully you can answer this one, but is there anything specific, whether or not you've read this in research or you see it in your practice, anything that you find specifically that tends to always come up in relationships? Whether it's a work relationship or romantic, or maybe there's specific things in romantic and specific things in friendships that come up that people seem to have difficulties with.
Good question. There's so much coming to mind right now. I think it's just difficult to be in relationship, period. Mm-hmm. And so I would say sort of this interface between people and the ways in which our own worldview or what's been passed down to us in our families interacts with what other people have grown up with and how they think. I think that's sort of the main sticking point for a lot of folks. So the Gottmans talk about this, that even if you're with somebody who grew up in the same neighborhood as you, any relationship is a cross-cultural experience because we have different families of origin, different genetic makeups, so on and so forth. And so thinking about that, how am I viewing the world? What are my stories of relationship, and how might those be different from the people in my life? Because I think we're so locked in our own perspective.
Yeah, totally. I'm just even thinking about my own internal family, mm-hmm. right? Parents and my 2 older brothers, how we all can have such different viewpoints on things and different viewpoints of the world, yet we all grew up in the same household. So obviously, we had different friends and we're different ages, and I'm sure we watched some different shows. There's so many things that can just impact your worldview and the way that you navigate relationships. So I can definitely see that being a big thing that comes up in any relationship.
For sure. And I think that lack of awareness that your worldview might be different from the other person's can get us into a lot of trouble. So there's this idea on social media right now of if he wanted to, he would. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I haven't seen it.
I'll hear people say, well, I shouldn't have to tell my friend not to do that. It should be so obvious. Or, in relationships, why wouldn't he know that I wanted a big celebration for my birthday? Isn't that just sort of baseline? But I think, we don't necessarily know what's going on in the other person's head, what their secret and clear expectations are without communicating openly about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Communication is key in everything.
Yes.
That is the one thing I think that people can take from this episode.
For sure.
Yeah. The 2 questions, I'll ask you the first one that I like to ask everybody. What is either one book that you've read recently or a podcast episode that you've listened to recently, or potentially both, that have impacted your health that you would like to share with the listeners?
Yeah. So probably 6 or 7 months ago now, I read this book called The Origins of You by Vienna Ferrone. It's excellent. It looks a lot at family of origin and then how that impacts how you go into future relationships. So romantic, friendship, work relationships, and so on, and really digging into what has been handed down to you by your family, what happened in your childhood, and then how can you soothe that, overcome that, heal that in adulthood. So that is excellent. More so looking at mental health, but like we spoke to earlier, I think that in turn has such an impact on your physical health.
Yeah.
Too. And then I just listened to this podcast. It's the Sex and Psychology podcast. And the specific episode was Don't Let Your Job Ruin Your Sex Life. And they talked a lot about boundaries, clear communication, saying no, and then the impact of sex and intimacy on the rest of your life and vice versa. And we didn't really talk about it much today, but having a healthy relationship with your sexuality and intimacy can have a big impact on your physical and mental health too. So that has some great takeaways.
Amazing. Well, maybe we can have you back and we can just have a whole intimacy, sex life podcast episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, working with people in the counseling space, sex and intimacy comes up so much in different forms. So it's definitely something I am comfortable talking about and find so fascinating. So there's a whole kind of tip of the iceberg that we just hit there and so much more to say. But that would be a recommendation. And in that one, they do talk about the physical impacts more. So that could be a good place.
Amazing. Yeah, I've read The Origins of You as well. Really good book. Yeah, I believe it has questions at the end of every chapter too that you can kind of like dive into and journal about, which
for sure
I always like in books because then you can just take some time and reflect. So
definitely. Yeah. She has some great reflection questions in there. And then she also identifies different potential childhood wounds. And so you can identify with those or not and sort of dig deeper into those. So, what would it mean to have a safety wound? What would it mean to have a deprioritization wound? These kinds of things, worthiness wound. And then that's potentially something that you could do self-reflection on by yourself, or if you're already working with some sort of mental health professional, begin to work through with them too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I will definitely have to have you back on so we can dive into so many more topics.
Yes, I would love to.
Yeah, before you run away, you can share with the listeners where they can find you, connect with you if anyone would like to connect.
Sounds good. So I am on Instagram at Emma Donald Counseling. People can also learn more about me on my website, emmadonaldcounseling.ca, and my email address and online booking site and phone number are on there as well. So those are good places to start.
Excellent. I'll put that in the show notes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks so much for coming on. Actually, I forgot one more question for you. I like to ask people, what does empowered health mean to you?
So empowered health to me means choice and autonomy. When I think about empowerment, I think about that ability to really sit back and contemplate what is right for you, and doing that from a place of abundance or a place of choice. So that's what comes to mind for me. How can you have the resources, the bandwidth, the time, etc., to choose your health team and choose the decisions in your life that feel right for you and your unique health?
Amazing. I love that. Awesome. Thank you so much for answering the questions and coming on. I learned so much, and I know everyone else will too.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Health Empowered. To support the show, please rate, review, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for support on your health journey, visit my website, empoweredmovement.ca. Have a great day and stay empowered on your health journey.